Hello.
Hey, Greg.
How are you, Rao?
Good.
Good. Okay. Um, we can go ahead and get started. Looks like we have a quorum. I'm sure others will join. Um, so we have a lot to talk about, especially technically and otherwise. Do we have a demo scheduled for today or not?
We don't. We're kind of waiting for
Yeah.
Raphael to do the next iteration of the
Okay.
demo.
Sounds good.
Of
Sounds
that.
good. All right. No worries. Okay. Well, I'll hand it over to you, Rao, and then we'll pick it up from there.
All right. I just pasted the link to community update 128 in the chat. Let me share my screen. So in terms of releases, the validator nodes on the mainnet are currently running 0925. And we are in the process of moving some of the mainnet validator nodes from the Google Cloud to the IBM Cloud. That has not started yet, but should start soon. The 09 testnet is also running 0925 right now, but we will soon be testing 0925.1 on that. 0925.1 is the second part, and I would say this has a bunch of the work, most of the work that's needed for last finalized state. So that's what we'll start testing on the testnet, probably starting tomorrow. Where we are with 0925.1, it has a total of 19 PRs. 16 of them are merged. 2 of them are about to be merged, either later today or early tomorrow. And the last one is tests on one of the PRs that NetZipper created. So that'll come in a little bit later, but we want to get started on the testing of 0925.1 on the different environments as soon as possible. It's been running on the sandbox for a few days now, and also on the mainnet observer nodes. The testnet was stuck for a little bit of time. That's why we didn't start it on the testnet, but I will speak to that in a little bit. So the observer nodes, one of the observer nodes on the mainnet is running 0925.1 right now, the EU observer node. And we're also going to start testing it on the exchange node on the mainnet. This is the one that's being used live by the exchanges for the transactions and so on and so forth. So what we will do initially is we'll create a duplicate of that, if you would, and try testing it on that, and then do it on the main exchange node on the mainnet. It may be confusing to people as to why so many iterations of testing and what's the difference between the observer nodes and exchange nodes and validator nodes, and why we are being so careful, and why are there so many steps to the testing. Basically, the main difference between testing on observer nodes or exchange nodes versus validator nodes is that when we test, much of the code is getting tested when we are running it on the observer nodes, but there are a couple of pieces that only occur. The code gets executed only on the validator nodes, but not on the observer nodes. So that's the main difference. The key piece that gets executed on the validator nodes, but not on the observer nodes, is the block creation code. So, and as a part of the block creation, there is a significant portion of the runtime manager runs as part of the block creation. So playing the deploys, which is what happens in the runtime manager, happens on the validator nodes, but not on the observer nodes. So this is the chunk of code, if you would, the block creation code and the machinery that it uses that does not get tested when we test on the observer or exchange nodes. This is the reason why we want to test both on the observer or exchange nodes as well as on the testnet. Because on the testnet, we execute it on the validator nodes also. And doing it on the mainnet observers and exchange gives us sort of an early inkling of, okay, how is this going to behave on the mainnet as opposed to the testnet? So that's the reason why we do it that way. We have these kind of 3-4 different scenarios, if you would, that we test before we touch the mainnet validators. Because when we get to the mainnet validators, we want to make sure that, yes, the validators have been tested on the testnet, and we know that there are no hiccups on the mainnet relative to the observers and exchanges. So that's kind of how we do that after some amount of testing on the sandbox. So with 0925.1, we are going to be starting testing on the testnet, and then once that all works, at some point we will move that onto the mainnet validators. So that's the work on 0921. Again, the main portion or content of 0925.1 is the last finalized state. There is still a couple of PRs that are related to last finalized state that we will be getting out in the 0926, but this is a significant chunk of work of the last finalized state that's going in. In terms of the other work that we have in progress, we noticed an issue on the testnet where one of the blocks was corrupt. I talked about tuple space mismatch earlier, and that was being addressed or is being addressed separately in the PRs, but this one was, this block corruption is a new one that also shows up as a tuple space. I mean, basically when we say tuple space problems, it's saying there is a problem in the state somewhere. So this is something that we're investigating as to why this is being caused. So we went ahead, even though this is just on the testnet, we went ahead, actually created, Tom Slough created a proposal to say, well, if a similar thing happens on the mainnet, how do we proceed so that one incorrect block doesn't stop the network. So he has put together a proposal. The team has reviewed that. The proposal is to correct and proceed in a situation where a block is corrupt for some reason. So that we'll probably have a little bit more discussion on the tech governance meeting about that. But with at least the team's review at this point in time, we're happy with the proposal. And we will proceed to implement that after the last finalized state. There was also a discussion on, once contracts are up on the mainnet, what is the methodology to get them updated? So there was Greg will speak more to this, but basically to distinguish between what is a short level configuration versus what is a contract or protocol level contract change, and how do we go about that. So Greg will be speaking more to that. Everything else I had mentioned earlier in the previous week, in the last weeks or earlier, so some of that work is ongoing. I already spoke to the SRE piece about the fact that we are moving some of the validator nodes from Google to IBM. We already moved the observers and we'll also move the exchange, one exchange node over to IBM. In the tech governance meeting last Thursday, which this is normally at 10 Eastern, or it's open to the whole community or anybody else that wants to join, 10 Eastern, 7 a.m. Pacific. So what we covered in the last session was we agreed to expose the RChip process in a broader way in the same repository where the RChip issues are being entered, discussed, and or prioritized and dealt with. So that's, we're taking the RChip process that's on Atlassian, creating a markdown version of it and putting it on GitHub. And any new variations and or changes to that would also be on the same RChip repository, so people can review that or comment on it. We discussed the risk of someone sending many deploys without sufficient rev for each, potentially causing a network slowdown and or spamming the log. Those kinds of side effects may be caused. So there was a discussion on this and potential ways of remedying this. We did not quite conclude on what should be done, but this is something that we will continue and perhaps either create a task in the development repository or as an RChip, depending on what needs to happen there. And then NetZipper is adding a couple of RChips specifically relating to this shard configuration and what can be changed or configured at the shard level, what is a core contract, and how can the POS contract be made mostly untouchable, meaning it doesn't have to be touched for shard configuration. So it would read the shard configuration and continue with that. So that's, this is part of what Greg is going to address now. So that's what happened on the tech governance. And then I was not able to attend the RChat meeting this last Saturday, but I understand there was progress made, and Gurinder is more involved with helping that effort of RChat. And then Raphael, at some point when he's ready, he's going to do the next demo of, he's going to demo the next iteration of DAPI. And also teach people how to use DAPI to create their own pages and blogs or whatever on DAPI. So that's my update. Are there any questions on any of this before I hand over to Greg to discuss the items I mentioned? All right, over to you, Greg.
Thanks, Ra. I appreciate that. That was a good summary. Kind of most important for this community, I think, is that we want to make a distinction between things that are governed at the protocol level, which means that we need the, that's the raison d'etre for the cooperative, right? The cooperative is here, and people can join the cooperative easily, so that everyone has a shot at participating in the governance of the protocol. And we want to distinguish that governance from specific parameters that are associated with a particular shard. The main dividing line, sort of one that we can easily get our hands around, is configuration parameters are shard level things, and smart contracts are protocol. So code represents protocol. Configuration parameters are shard level things. That should be relatively straightforward to understand, relatively easy to discriminate and determine. So that does, one of the consequences of that, however, is it doesn't mean that someone who launches a shard in which one of the smart contracts has been modified. For example, the most important one is the proof of stake contract, right? So you could imagine that someone launches a version of the shard and they modify the proof of stake contract. Does that immediately disqualify them from participating in the shard tree? And the answer is no. What it means is that everyone has a chance to review whether or not they want to engage in or participate in transactions that touch resources in that shard. And you need to think to one way to put this in perspective, I guess is the best way to say it, is the sharding mechanism is also the mechanism for interoperability with other networks. So the idea is that we will be able to integrate and interoperate with Ethereum and other kinds of blockchains as if they were shards mounted on RChain. So obviously they don't have the same protocol, they don't have the same smart contracts running, they don't have the same code running, essentially. And so this dividing line doesn't prevent shards that do change the protocol from participating, but it gives anyone who wants to engage with transactions that involve resources in that shard the opportunity to decide whether or not that's something they want to participate in. Any questions about that sort of basic policy framework? This is where it's really important that as co-op members, you understand what this means and our rights and obligations with respect to maintaining the protocol. Okay, I guess this is perfectly clear and no one has any questions about this. All right, moving on to the other piece of the puzzle, what Rao was talking about in terms of our in terms of sequencing and resources on the dev side. We want to make sure that before we go any further with block merge and things like that, that we have nailed down what we believe to be these critical bugs. So the corruption of blocks and the and things that are related to that. So there is some work that we will be putting first to make sure that that's taken care of. The team was, we did a review of the design proposal to address this issue, and we'll be, as we have more estimates on what that will take, we'll make sure that the community knows, but this is the right thing to do. And this is related to other decisions. So for example, until we have block merge, we will still be having blocks submitted in round robin. And because of that, it does not make sense, except in a few exceptional cases, members who are close to home, to have nodes outside of the fold. So for example, if there was an exchange that wanted to run their own nodes, the path for that for the next couple of epochs will be the co-op will run the nodes on their behalf, so that the co-op is the one that's on the hook to make sure that those nodes are up and responsive, so that the network doesn't get stuck because one of the nodes is stuck. But then after block merge comes online, then it will make sense to transition nodes that the co-op is running on behalf of other parties over into their care. Again, there are some exceptions here. Some folks who braved the early stages who will be running their own nodes. And that's also an important part of the mix because it gives us key information about environmental conditions that we can't simulate except by doing it. So, but by and large, that's the policy. And so some of these decisions bear more weight. So if we can't have a critical bug like the block corruption bug with validators in the wild suffering that potential situation. So better to have the nodes under the co-op control, and then as we nail this bug and then get block merged, then we can have nodes being outside of the co-op control. Hopefully that makes sense. Any questions or comments about that?
Going back to shard configurations, because there were no questions there, could you perhaps elaborate and paint maybe a couple other scenarios? You mentioned perhaps a shard running Ethereum, but if you go into a little more detail and even where there might be conflicts or what has to be agreed upon between shards.
So in general, what you've got is you've got the backing contracts. So if we just keep it homogeneous, so it's just RChain shards, then the relationship is that the parent's rev backs the child's rev. In the case of a heterogeneous network, then there will be essentially a contract enforced exchange rate, and a corresponding contract that provides the atomic swap, so to speak. So we've talked about this quite a bit over the last couple of years. Are there any specific questions that you have here, Ian?
No, but that helps. The example you just gave.
Okay, cool. So then in that case, as long as the transactions stay within a particular shard, so they involve only resources in that shard, then they effectively don't have to go up the tree, right? They're validated at the child. If the transactions involve resources across two different shards, then you have to go up to the common ancestor to get proper validation. So the more resources that you have that are crossing shard boundaries, the slower and more complicated you get in terms of the consensus apparatus. So obviously, if you start having lots of transactions that cross these shard boundaries, then it becomes economically advantageous for those resources to, the shards that govern those resources, to join forces and become a single shard, essentially to merge in some way. And we're hoping that market forces are sufficient to drive that, but if not, then we can start looking at automation of those kinds of processes to the extent that that's possible. But that's pretty far down the line, but hopefully people understand some of the implications here, right? So transactions that are limited to a particular shard stay within that shard, and as a result don't have the same kind of cost in terms of consensus. Transactions that cross shards have to go as far up the tree as the common ancestor, and then potentially all of the shards are involved in the consensus for those transactions. And so rejiggering the shards for popular transactions that involve resources across shards is the right thing to do to optimize the network. Any questions about that? Okay then. So those are the main technical updates. We appreciate all those who've sent in their Rev addresses. I think that we're going to be putting out a tutorial video for how one might go about creating a Rev address in case. Yeah, Ian's posted in the chat about the incentives for getting your Rev address in before the 31st of July. Okay, and we'll be putting out a tutorial for those people who are, possibly, need some help generating a Rev address. With that, let me turn it over to Daryl, who will do the community and review segment.
Hey, everybody. So here's the Community Week in Review for Thursday, July 9th to today, Wednesday, July 15th. On Thursday, July 9th, there was the Governance Committee meeting. The committee discussed the process of providing Governance Committee meeting summaries to the members via Google Docs and Discord. Steve Henley presented the RChain Co-op strategic plan and how it relates to the Governance Committee. In addition, the committee discussed how to improve the quality of the strategic plan and identify individuals with whom to engage to accomplish this. On Friday, the Climate Coordination RCast. This week, we discussed the recent flooding in Newport Beach and an increase of plastic pollution in the oceans due to COVID. This was followed by a discussion on fractals, as well as how Tesla is now worth more than Exxon, furthering the signal that a major shift has occurred away from a fossil fuel dominated economy. On Saturday, July 11th, there was the RChat call. The discussion revolved around logistics of minimum requirements of the voting DApp. Jim questioned how DAPI, Zulip, and RChain all interconnect and the relation between Theo's anonymous functional voting with liquid democracy decision-making. More digging into how DAPI, Zulip, and RChain all interconnect. Dan is going to work on mapping out a flow to find the path of least resistance. On Monday, July 13th, was a Casper stand-up. And this week's Casper stand-up related to sharding, relates sharding to the World Wide Web. And also on Monday was the blockchain art call. And the discussion revolved around the logistics of turning Eric's work on his master's degree into a viable software project. Also on Monday was the China team call, and the China team worked towards finalizing contracts for both the financial and development community marketing proposals. On Tuesday, the RChain education meeting, there was a presentation of the design of a simple Rolang language written in Scala. The main focus is to describe the state and operations which manipulate the state. The example also defines structural equivalence and simple reduction rules. And also yesterday, the communications working group meeting, we mainly discussed the China marketing plans and how to develop and integrate with them. And there was also the app developer working group meeting where they built an updated Zulip voting bot as a potential starting point for co-op voting in November. And then today, in this morning's dev stand-up, they did a walkthrough for each of the wallets and went through the process of how to generate a Rev address for voting. Just an hour ago in Jim's room, the members hangout, we discussed the concept of creating a hardware chip for RChain. HJ brought up the news that Tunisia is launching their own cryptocurrency. We discussed preparing walkthrough vids to demonstrate how to create and submit Rev addresses for the upcoming AGM voting process. And Jim showed his efforts towards building a Zulip voting bot. And that brings us up to now.
That's a lot of activity. Thank you.
Indeed. Any questions for Daryl about the community in review?
Only if he has ever considered a career in the mainstream news.
I don't look
because
into
that was done so well.
Indeed.
As Theo also said in the chat.
Nice.
Very good. In terms of additional outreach outside of the RChain community, so yesterday, Mike Stay, Christian Williams, and I had a very good and engaging conversation with Grigore Rosu and one of his graduate students. Grigore Rosu is the principal behind the K framework and matching logic. And so we were sort of comparing notes about operational semantics and logical form, which used to be called ladle, and matching logic, and the sort of the differences in approaches and what our aims and goals were. So that was a surprisingly animated and engaging conversation. We look forward to additional engagement there. And then this Friday, the co-op will be ciao, Daryl. This Friday we'll be having an AMA with Bihu, which is a blockchain media operation in China. So the topic for the AMA is the role of types in refactoring the internet, which is that will give me a chance to sort of warm up more detailed technical talk that I'll be giving with Protocol Labs in August. So any questions about those?
That's bihu.com.
I think so, yeah. They're largely, yeah, I think so. They're a Chinese operation, so it's hard for me to ascertain, what is their properties versus another company's. Okay, any questions or comments from the community? Going once. Twice. All right. Thank you so much for your participation today, and I hope everyone is staying safe. And I will be seeing some of you on Friday, I'm sure.